After 2 decades of avoiding his father's grave, James finds a sealed envelope hidden inside an old toolbox in his father's garage. The letter, written in his father's trembling handwriting just days before his death, contains words that will shatter everything James believed about their fractured relationship and force him to confront the truth he's been running from since he was 17 years old. The garage door groaned like something wounded as James pulled it open. 20 years of rust and neglect had seized the hinges, and it took 3 hard yanks before the door surrendered, flooding the dim space with afternoon sunlight that seemed almost offensive in its brightness. The smell hit him immediately. Motor oil, old wood, something metallic and sharp that might have been time itself decomposing. 42 years old, and this was the first time James had stepped into his father's garage since he was 17. Since the night everything shattered. He stood at the threshold, 1 foot inside and 1 foot still in his mother's driveway, as if his body couldn't quite commit to the trespass. 3 months since her funeral. 3 months since he'd inherited this house in Millbrook, Tennessee, along with all its ghosts and unfinished business. His sister Rebecca had begged him from Portland to at least sort through their father's things before selling the property. There might be something worth keeping, she'd said on the phone last week, her voice carrying that particular tone of hope that made James want to hang up. Worth keeping, as if anything in this garage could be worth the weight it would add to his life. Dust particles swirled in the shaft of sunlight, creating galaxies in miniature. James forced himself to step fully inside, his sneakers crunching on the gritty concrete floor. The space was exactly as he remembered it, his father's sacred domain, the place where Reverend Robert Harrison came to escape sermons and expectations and the performance of being Millbrook's most devoted Baptist preacher. Pegboard walls lined with tools arranged in perfect symmetry. A workbench running the length of the back wall, its surface scarred with decades of projects James had never been invited to join. His father's 1976 Chevy pickup truck covered with a tarp that had turned grey with dust, taking up most of the garage like a monument to masculine silence. James had a habit of cracking his knuckles when he was anxious, a nervous tic that drove his ex-wife crazy during their 8 years of marriage. He was doing it now, 1 knuckle at a time, the small pops echoing in the garage's cathedral-like quiet. He'd driven 7 hours from Chicago, telling himself this was just business. Clear out the house, sign the papers, drive back to his carefully constructed life where he never had to think about his father or this town or the boy he used to be before everything turned to ash. But standing here, breathing air that still somehow carried traces of his father's Old Spice aftershave mixed with sawdust, James felt 17 again, felt the old anger rising like bile, felt the old questions circling like vultures. Why was righteousness more important than relationship? Why did loving God have to mean losing his son? Why couldn't his father just once say he was proud of James for being James, not disappointed in James for failing to be someone else? He moved toward the workbench, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light away from the door. Tools hung in their designated spots, hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches, all clean and organized with the same precision his father brought to his sermons. Robert Harrison believed in order, in everything having its place, in no room for deviation or mess or sons who wanted to play guitar instead of studying theology, who wanted to move to Chicago instead of staying in Millbrook, who wanted to live their own lives instead of living the life their preacher father had scripted before they were even born. James obsessed over coffee, not just drinking it, but the entire ritual. He'd wake at 5:30 every morning, grind beans by hand, use a French press with exactly 4 minutes of steeping time, pour it into the same blue ceramic mug his son Daniel had made him in 3rd grade. It was the one thing in his life he could control completely, the one thing that never disappointed him. His ex-wife used to say he loved his coffee routine more than he loved her. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd learned early that loving things was safer than loving people. Beneath the workbench, James noticed a row of metal toolboxes. Red, industrial, the kind that lasted generations. His father had been meticulous about his tools, treating them with more tenderness than he'd ever shown James. At least, that's how it felt. Maybe that wasn't fair. Maybe memory was a liar that bent truth into the shape of old wounds. But fair or not, James remembered every criticism, every disappointed sigh, every sermon his father preached about obedience and honor, while James sat in the 3rd pew, wondering why God's love always felt like judgment. He pulled out the largest toolbox, grunting at its weight. It scraped across the concrete, leaving a clean trail through the dust. The latches were stiff, but gave way with some effort. Inside, socket wrenches organized by size, electrical tape, wire cutters, a level, spare sandpaper, everything exactly where it should be. Everything except James's breath caught. Nestled in the bottom tray, wrapped in a faded red handkerchief, was something that didn't belong. Something that had nothing to do with carpentry or repair or the kind of work that happened in garages. He lifted the handkerchief carefully, as if it might disintegrate at his touch, and felt the shape of something rectangular beneath the fabric. An envelope. No, not just any envelope. Thick, cream-colored paper, the expensive kind his father used only for important occasions, weddings, funerals, final words, and pressed into red wax that sealed the envelope shut was the unmistakable impression of his father's signet ring, the one with the cross and the letter H intertwined. The one James used to stare at during Sunday dinners, watching it catch the light as his father's hands moved, those strong carpenter hands that built church pews and fixed neighbors' porches and never once reached out to touch James with simple affection. His name was written across the front, for James. But this wasn't his father's usual handwriting. The strong, authoritative script James remembered from angry notes left on his teenage bedroom door, from birthday cards that felt more like obligation than love. This handwriting trembled. The letters tilted and shook like someone had written them during an earthquake, or while dying, or both. Below his name, one more line. To be opened when you're ready to hear the truth. The truth. James let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. What truth? That he'd failed as a son. That walking out at 17 had been the ultimate sin. That 20 years of silence had been justified because James was the one who left. James was the one who refused to come to the funeral. James was the one who couldn't forgive. He should throw it away, toss it in one of the trash bags he'd brought for this exact purpose, clearing out the debris of a relationship that had died long before his father's body gave out. He should drive back to Chicago and his architecture firm, and his every other weekend custody arrangement with Daniel, and forget this letter existed. But he didn't throw it away. Instead, James sat down on the cold concrete floor, his back against his father's truck, the envelope resting in his lap like something radioactive. Outside, he could hear the neighborhood sounds of a Thursday afternoon, a lawnmower several houses down, kids laughing, a dog barking. Life continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis, as if James wasn't sitting in his dead father's garage, holding words that had waited 20 years to be read. The envelope felt heavier than paper should feel, as if grief and regret and love, if there was any love, had physical weight. James turned it over in his hands, studying every detail, delaying the moment when he'd have to break that seal and face whatever his father had left unsaid. James sat there for what might have been minutes or might have been an hour. Time moved differently in this garage, thick and slow like the motor oil that stained the concrete near the drain. His phone buzzed twice, probably Rebecca checking on his progress, but he ignored it. Whatever was in this letter demanded his full attention, even if he wasn't ready to give it yet. He stood up finally, his knees protesting, and moved to his father's workbench. Someone, his mother probably, had left it exactly as Robert Harrison must have left it the last time he worked here. A half-finished birdhouse sat at one end, its roof not yet attached, a pencil mark showing where the final cut should go. His father never finished it. Cancer doesn't care about unfinished projects. James set the envelope down on the workbench and stared at it. The afternoon sun had shifted, and now a beam of light hit the red wax seal directly, making it glow like an ember. His father's ring. He could remember being 6 years old, sitting on a stool in this very garage, watching his father work on some project, asking if he could try on the ring. His father had smiled, one of the rare times James remembered him smiling, and slipped it onto James's thumb. "Someday this might be yours," he'd said, "when you're ready to carry what it means." But James had never gotten the ring. After the funeral, Rebecca mentioned that their father had been buried wearing it, taking his authority, his righteousness, his standards, taking everything that had stood between them, into the grave. James picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The wax crumbled easily, falling onto the workbench in small red fragments like drops of dried blood. Inside were 3 sheets of paper covered in that trembling handwriting, and something else, a photograph. James pulled out the photo first, and felt something inside his chest crack open. It was a picture he'd never seen before. Him at 17, sitting on the front steps of this house, guitar across his lap, head bent in concentration. His hair was longer then, constantly falling into his eyes, and he wore a Nirvana t-shirt his father had hated. But it wasn't the image of himself that made James's hands start shaking. It was what he could see through the living room window behind him. His father, partially hidden by curtains, watching James play. And the expression on Robert Harrison's face was nothing like the disappointment and anger James remembered. It was loss, pure, aching loss, as if he were watching his son disappear even while James sat right there, 10 feet away, separated only by glass and pride. James set the photograph down carefully and unfolded the letter. His father's voice rose from the page, stronger than that shaking handwriting suggested, and James could hear it in his head, that deep preacher's voice that had filled First Baptist Church every Sunday for 30 years. "My dear son, James, I am writing this 3 days after the doctors told me the cancer has spread to my brain and spine. I have perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less. Your mother doesn't know I'm writing this. She thinks I should let sleeping dogs lie, that reaching out now after 20 years will only cause more pain. But I have been in pain since the night you left, and I suspect you have too. So here is my truth, offered too late, but offered honestly. Because I am out of time for pride and into the season of reckoning." James had to stop reading. He walked to the garage door, stepped out into the sunlight, breathed in air that didn't smell like his father's ghost. His chest felt tight. His eyes burned. He'd built such a careful story about Robert Harrison, the rigid preacher who cared more about reputation than relationship, who chose his church over his son, who let James walk out that door at 17 without fighting to bring him back. That story had kept James safe for 20 years, protected him from the softer, more complicated truth that might have required forgiveness. He went back inside, picked up the letter, continued reading. "I need you to know what happened the night you left. The night we had that terrible fight about your music, about Chicago, about your future. I said unforgivable things. I told you that you were throwing away everything we'd built for you, that you were breaking your mother's heart, that if you walked out that door you wouldn't be welcome back until you came to your senses. And you walked out, and I let you. And James, son, that was the worst mistake of my life." James's vision blurred. He wiped at his eyes angrily. He didn't want to cry, didn't want to give his father's words that power. But the tears came anyway, hot and unexpected, 20 years of them apparently waiting for permission. "Here's what you didn't know. The next morning, I got in my truck at 5 in the morning and drove to Chicago. It took me 8 hours because I didn't know the way, and got lost twice. I found your apartment. Your mother had gotten the address from Rebecca, who got it from your friend Marcus. I sat in my truck across the street from your building for 6 hours. I watched you leave around 10, guitar case on your back, and walked to the bus stop. You looked so young, James, so determined, and so young, and I sat there with my hand on the door handle, telling myself to get out, to cross the street, to knock on your door and tell you I was sorry." James's knees gave out. He sank onto the stool by the workbench, the letter shaking in his hands. His father had come to Chicago. Had been there, right there, and James had never known. All those first months in Chicago when James was terrified and lonely and too proud to call home, his father had been there, within reach. But I didn't get out of the truck. I told myself you needed to learn the hard way, that apologizing would send the wrong message, would condone your rebellion. I told myself a lot of things that were really just cowardice dressed up as principle. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd reject my apology. Afraid you'd see how much I was hurting. Afraid that if I cracked open even a little, I'd fall completely apart. So I drove home, and I never told anyone I'd gone, and I've regretted it every single day since. If this story has touched your heart so far, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced something similar. These stories matter because your stories matter. James read the words again, then again. His father had driven to Chicago, had sat outside his apartment, had almost apologized. The trajectory of 20 years might have been different if Robert Harrison had just opened that truck door, if James had looked out his window at the right moment, if pride hadn't been stronger than love for both of them. James stood up and paced the length of the garage, the letter clutched in his hand. His mind was reeling, trying to reconcile this new information with the story he'd been telling himself for 2 decades. His father in Chicago, his father watching him from across the street, his father almost apologizing. It didn't fit. It cracked the foundation of every assumption James had built his adult life upon. He looked at the old Chevy truck under its tarp. That truck. His father had driven that truck to Chicago 20 years ago, had sat in it for 6 hours, hand on the door handle, wrestling with pride and fear and whatever love looked like when filtered through a man who'd been raised to believe emotion was weakness. James reached out and touched the tarp, felt the shape of the vehicle beneath it. Solid, real, a witness to a journey James had never known about. He returned to the letter, forcing himself to continue reading. I need to tell you about your grandfather. My father. I've never talked about him much because it was too painful, and because I learned early that men in our family don't discuss pain. We bury it and hope it doesn't dig itself back up. But you deserve context for why I am the way I am. Why I was the way I was with you. James's grandfather had died when James was 3. He had almost no memory of the man, just a vague impression of someone tall and silent who smelled like cigarettes and leather. His father never talked about him. At family gatherings, when relatives would share stories about the past, Robert Harrison would find reasons to leave the room. My father, your grandfather, Thomas Harrison, was a coal miner in eastern Kentucky. He worked underground 6 days a week and drank himself unconscious most evenings. He was a hard man, James, the kind of hard that comes from a hard life. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to go to seminary to become a preacher. I thought he might be proud. Instead, he laughed. Then he beat me so severely I couldn't go to school for a week. He said preachers were con men, that I was too weak for real work, that I'd embarrass the family. James felt something shift in his chest. He'd never known this. His father, beaten for wanting to serve God, for wanting to escape the mines, for dreaming of something different. I left home at 17, James. Same age you left this house. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through seminary. I didn't speak to my father for 8 years. When I finally went back, your mother convinced me to, said I'd regret it if I didn't. He was dying of black lung. And you know what his last words to me were? I was wrong about you, boy. You made something of yourself. That's all. No, I love you. No, I'm sorry. Just that grudging admission that maybe I wasn't the failure he'd predicted. James sat down again, his legs suddenly weak. The garage felt smaller now, crowded with the ghosts of 3 generations of Harrison men who couldn't say what they meant, who confused strength with silence, who passed down patterns of pain like heirlooms. I swore I'd be different with my own children. I'd be the father he never was. I'd be present, involved, supportive. But James, here's what I learned too late. You can't give what you never received. I didn't know how to show affection because no one showed me. I didn't know how to say I'm proud of you because no one ever said it to me. I thought providing and protecting and preaching right from wrong was enough. I thought love was discipline and structure and making sure you turned out better than I did. The letter trembled in James's hands. He thought about his own son, Daniel, 15 years old now, living with his mother in Chicago, visiting James every other weekend. Dark-haired and sullen, so angry all the time, so much like James had been at that age. They'd had a fight last month. Daniel wanted to drop out of his advanced math class to join a band, and James had said absolutely not, had given him a whole speech about not throwing away opportunities, about thinking of the future, and Daniel had looked at him with such contempt and said, "You sound just like someone who'd make their own kid miserable, just like someone who'd make their own kid miserable." James hadn't been able to respond. The words had hit too close to something true. He was doing it. Despite swearing he'd be different, despite all his awareness and therapy and promises to himself, he was recreating the same dynamic. Different details, same pattern. Father who thought he knew best. Son who just wanted to be seen. When you walked out that night, I saw my father in myself. The rigidity, the inability to bend, the belief that being right was more important than being loving. And I hated it, but I didn't know how to change it. I was 52 years old and I didn't know how to tell my son I was wrong, that I was scared, that I loved him so much it terrified me, that watching him choose a path I didn't understand felt like losing him, and I'd rather push him away on my own terms than risk him leaving and breaking my heart. Outside the garage, James heard a car pull into a driveway nearby. A door slammed. A woman's voice called out something about dinner. Normal life. The kind of life where fathers and sons talked about ordinary things and didn't carry 20 years of silence between them like a third presence at every meal. So, I pushed you away. I said terrible things. I let you believe I chose my pride over you. And then I was too much of a coward to drive to Chicago and tell you the truth, that I broke my own heart that night, not just yours, that I've carried the weight of what I said to you for 20 years, like a stone in my chest. James's phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it. Rebecca, Mom's lawyer called about the estate. Can you handle the paperwork? I can't get away from work. He typed back, yes. Send. One word, because he didn't trust himself with more. He picked up the photograph again, his father watching him through the window. How many times had that happened? How many times had James sat on those porch steps, headphones on, guitar in his lap, thinking he was alone and unwatched and free, while his father stood inside the house looking out with an expression James had interpreted as disapproval? What if it had never been disapproval? What if it had always been this, longing, loss, love, that didn't know how to bridge the gap between itself and its object? Your mother knows I'm dying, but she doesn't know how afraid I am not of death. I've preached about death for 30 years and I believe what I preached, but I'm afraid of dying with you thinking I didn't love you, with you carrying the weight of my failures for the rest of your life, with you maybe doing to Daniel what I did to you, because that's how these things work when we don't break the pattern. James felt like he'd been punched. Daniel. His father knew about Daniel. Of course he did. Rebecca would have told their mother and their mother would have told Robert, but seeing his son's name in his father's handwriting, seeing his father worry about the same intergenerational curse James worried about in his darkest moments, it made everything more real, more urgent. Time was collapsing, past and present, bleeding into each other. 3 generations of Harrison men, all trapped in the same prison of masculine silence. I watched you play guitar on that porch almost every evening your last summer at home. You didn't know I watched. I stood at that window and listened, and James, you were brilliant. You had something I never had, the ability to take what was inside and make it beautiful, to transform pain into art. I envied you that, and because I envied you, because it highlighted what I couldn't do, I criticized it. I called it a waste of time. I said you'd never make a living at music. I turned my own inadequacy into your burden. The birdhouse on the workbench caught James's eye, unfinished, his father's last project. He walked over to it, picked it up, examined the clean cuts, the careful joinery, the pencil marks showing where the final pieces should go. His father had been good with his hands, could build anything, but he'd never been able to build a bridge across the gap between him and his son. James set the birdhouse down and picked up the letter one more time. There was still 1 page left, one more page of truth that had waited 20 years to be read. His hands were steadier now, or maybe he was just numb. Maybe there was only so much revelation a person could absorb before the system shut down, before emotion gave way to a strange, clear calm. James walked out of the garage again, needing air, needing distance, needing something other than the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. The sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Golden hour, photographers called it. The time of day when everything looked more beautiful than it really was. James had always thought that was an appropriate metaphor for memory, the way distance and time made even painful moments glow with a kind of terrible beauty. He stood in the driveway and called his son. It rang 4 times before Daniel answered, his voice wary. Dad? It's not your weekend. I know. James stopped. What was he supposed to say? I'm standing in my dead father's driveway reading a letter that's destroying everything I thought I knew. I'm realizing I've been doing to you what my father did to me. I'm terrified I'm going to die before I can fix this. I just wanted to hear your voice, buddy. Silence on the other end. Then, are you okay? No, James said, surprising himself with the honesty. No, I'm not okay. I'm in Tennessee at Grandma's house, cleaning out your grandfather's things, and I found... He stopped again. The letter felt too private, too raw. I found something that's making me think about a lot of things. Like what? Daniel's voice had lost some of its wariness, curiosity replacing defense. Like how I haven't been the father I wanted to be. Like how I've been too hard on you about school, about your future, about the band. James took a breath. This was harder than he'd expected. You were right last month. When you said I sounded like someone who'd make their own kid miserable, you were right. More silence, then quietly, "I didn't mean it like that." "Yeah, you did, and you should have, because it's true." James looked back at the garage, at the open door spilling darkness into the golden light. "My father and I didn't speak for 20 years, Daniel. 20 years. Because we were both too proud and too scared to admit we'd hurt each other, and I'm terrified of that happening with us. I'm terrified I'm going to wake up one day and realize you're gone, and I never told you the things that matter." "Dad, I'm proud of you," James said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm proud of you for knowing what you want, for caring about music, for being brave enough to fight me when you think I'm wrong. I'm proud of you for being nothing like me." He could hear Daniel breathing on the other end of the line, then, voice thick, "I don't want to be nothing like you. I just want you to see me." James felt tears on his face. "I know, I'm sorry, I'm going to do better." "Okay," Daniel said. Then, "Are you coming home soon?" "Yeah, soon. I just need to finish some things here first." They said goodbye, and James stood in the driveway for a long moment, phone in his hand, trying to collect himself. The conversation hadn't fixed anything, but it was a start. The first time in Daniel's entire life that James had apologized, really apologized, without defending himself or explaining why he'd been right to do what he'd done. That had to count for something. He went back into the garage. The letter waited on the workbench where he'd left it, patient as death. James picked it up and read the final page. "There's something else you need to know, James. Something I've kept secret because I was ashamed, and because I thought it would hurt your mother too much if it came out. But you deserve the truth, all of it, even the parts that make me look worse than I already do." James felt his pulse quicken. What else could there be? What revelation could possibly be bigger than what he'd already read? "The summer before you left, I was struggling. The church was struggling. Attendance was down, donations were down, and the board was talking about bringing in a younger preacher. I was 52 and felt like I was being put out to pasture. Your mother didn't know how worried I was. I hid it from her, from everyone, because that's what I did. I hid." James remembered that summer, remembered his father being more irritable than usual, spending even more time in this garage, in his study, anywhere but with the family. James had assumed it was because of him, because his father was disappointed in who James was becoming. But maybe it had never been about James at all. Maybe everyone's pain is just their own pain, and we're all so trapped in our own stories, we can't see that other people's reactions have nothing to do with us. There was a woman in the congregation, Sarah Mitchell. Her husband had left her, and she came to me for counseling. And James, I started looking forward to those sessions more than I should have. She saw me differently than your mother did. She saw me as someone wise and compassionate, not as someone failing at everything that mattered. I never touched her. I need you to know that. I never crossed that line. But emotionally, I was unfaithful. I was giving her the parts of myself I should have been giving to your mother, to you, to Rebecca. James sat down on the stool, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. His father, emotionally involved with someone else. His father, not the moral paragon James had alternately worshipped and resented, but just a man, flawed, struggling, human. When you started talking about leaving for Chicago, about pursuing music, about building a life I didn't understand, it triggered something in me. It felt like everything was falling apart at once. My career, my marriage, my son. And instead of dealing with any of it honestly, instead of admitting I was scared and overwhelmed and didn't know what to do, I lashed out at the one thing I felt like I could control. You. James closed his eyes. The garage spun slightly. Too much information. Too many revelations. The man he'd spent 20 years hating and missing in equal measure was dissolving, being replaced by someone more complicated. Someone who'd made terrible mistakes, not out of malice, but out of fear. Someone who'd hurt people he loved because he didn't know how to ask for help. I ended things with Sarah, or rather, I stopped counseling her and avoided her until she left the church. I never told your mother. I should have. That's another failure on a long list. But I'm telling you because I want you to understand something, son. The night you left, the things I said, they weren't really about you. They were about me feeling like I was losing control of everything. You were just the unfortunate target of a broken man's panic. The letter continued for another paragraph, but James had to stop reading. He stood up and walked around the garage, touching things at random, a rake hanging on the wall, a shelf of paint cans, the hood of the truck, grounding himself in the physical world because the emotional world had become too much. His father had been human, weak, scared, just like James was weak and scared. Just like Daniel would probably be weak and scared when he became a father. The curse wasn't cruelty. It was fear passed down like a genetic trait, fear of being seen as inadequate, fear of admitting vulnerability. James returned to the letter and forced himself to finish it. The cancer has given me an unexpected gift, clarity. When you know you're dying, all the things that seemed important reveal themselves as trivial, and all the things you ignored reveal themselves as essential. Here's what's essential, James. I love you. I have always loved you. I loved you the night you left. I loved you every day of the 20 years we didn't speak. I loved you when I sat in my truck in Chicago, too afraid to knock on your door. I loved you imperfectly, cowardly, silently, but I loved you. And I need you to know that. I need you to carry that knowledge forward, because maybe it will help you love Daniel better than I loved you. Maybe you can break the pattern I couldn't break. James's vision blurred again. The words on the page swam. His father loved him, had always loved him. 3 simple words that James had waited his entire life to hear, spoken too late to matter, and yet somehow mattering more than anything. James set the letter down on the workbench and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes until he saw stars. 20 years. 20 years of silence that could have been ended with a phone call, an email, a letter delivered before death, made it a posthumous confession. Why did people wait until it was too late? Why did pride have to be stronger than love until the very end? He picked up the letter again. There was a postscript at the bottom of the page, added in even shakier handwriting, as if his father had returned to the letter after setting it aside. P.S. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally come back to Millbrook. It means you're in my garage, probably feeling 1,000 conflicting things. There's something I need to tell you about this place, about why I spent so much time here. James looked around the garage with new eyes. What secret could a garage hold? When you were little, maybe 5 or 6 years old, you used to follow me out here every Saturday morning. You'd sit on that stool by the workbench and ask a million questions while I worked on projects. You wanted to help, wanted to hand me tools, wanted to learn how everything worked. And James, those were the happiest hours of my week. Just you and me in this garage, no expectations, no performance, just a father and son building things together. James had no memory of this. Or did he? Something flickered at the edge of his consciousness. The smell of sawdust, his father's large hand guiding his smaller one, the satisfying sound of a hammer hitting a nail just right. Maybe he did remember. Maybe he'd just buried it along with everything else that hurt too much to hold. But then you got older, 7, 8, 9, and you stopped following me out here. You got interested in other things, books, music, friends, and I didn't know how to call you back. Didn't know how to say I miss our Saturday mornings without sounding pathetic. So I just came out here alone, worked on projects alone, and told myself it was fine, boys grow up, that's natural. But I missed you, James. I missed you long before you actually left. James stood up and walked to the workbench. He ran his hand along its scarred surface, feeling the grooves and dents of decades of work. Somewhere in this wood was the history of those Saturday mornings he couldn't quite remember. Somewhere in this garage was the ghost of a little boy who loved his father uncomplicated, and the ghost of a father who didn't know how to keep that love simple. He opened the drawers of the workbench one by one, not sure what he was looking for. The first drawer, screws and nails sorted meticulously into small containers. The second, measuring tapes, pencils, a notebook with his father's handwriting recording dimensions and materials for various projects. The third drawer stuck. James pulled harder, and it finally gave way, revealing something unexpected. A wooden box, handmade with careful joinery and a sliding lid. James lifted it out and set it on the workbench. The wood was smooth, polished by years of handling. He slid the lid open and felt his heart stop. Inside were dozens of photographs, all of him. James at 6 with a missing front tooth. James at 10 holding a science fair trophy. James at 13, gangly and awkward. James at 15 playing guitar. Not the photo that had been in the letter, but others. So many others. His father had been documenting his life in secret, collecting these moments like a man building a case for why his son was worth loving. But there was more. Beneath the photographs were newspaper clippings. James pulled them out with shaking hands. Articles from the Chicago Tribune's architecture section about buildings his firm had designed. A review of a small concert where James had played guitar with a local band. He'd been 23, and he'd had no idea anyone from Millbrook knew about it. let alone cared enough to save the review. An article about the community centre James's firm had donated their services to design. His father had been following him. For 20 years, through newspapers and internet searches and God knows what else, Robert Harrison had been tracking his son's life from a distance, collecting evidence that James was okay, that he was successful, that he was building something meaningful even if it wasn't the life his father had wanted for him. James sat down hard on the stool, the box in his lap, photographs spilling across his legs. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. His father had never stopped caring, never stopped watching, never stopped being proud, even if he couldn't say it. All those years, James had convinced himself Robert Harrison was content with the silence, relieved to have his disappointing son out of his life. All those years had been a lie. At the very bottom of the box was a small piece of paper, folded into quarters. James opened it carefully as if it might disintegrate. It was a program from First Baptist Church, dated 6 years ago. Someone had circled an announcement in blue ink. Musical guest, Sarah Chen, accompanied by James Harrison on guitar. James's breath stopped. 6 years ago. He'd been visiting Rebecca in Portland, and she'd convinced him to play guitar for a friend's wedding at a small church across town. He'd used his full name, James Harrison, without thinking, because it had felt safe. He was hundreds of miles from Tennessee. What were the chances anyone from his old life would hear about it? But his father had heard. Somehow, through some network James couldn't fathom, Robert Harrison had learned that his son was playing guitar in a church in Portland, and he'd printed the announcement, and he'd kept it, and he'd circled it in blue ink like it was the most important news in the world. James set the program down carefully next to the box of photographs. His hands were shaking. The walls of the garage seemed to be breathing. Everything he'd believed about the past 20 years was crumbling, being replaced by a truth that was somehow more painful than the lie had been, because the lie had been clean. The lie had let James be the injured party, the righteous one, the son who'd been wronged. This truth was messy. This truth said they'd both been wrong, they'd both been cowards, they'd both chosen silence over risk, absence over possible rejection. There was a sudden noise behind him, a car door slamming. James turned to see Rebecca walking up the driveway, her face concerned. She must have gotten worried when he didn't respond to her texts. She stopped at the garage entrance, taking in the scene. James, surrounded by photographs and newspaper clippings, tears on his face, the letter on the workbench. "Oh, James," she said softly, "you found it." He stared at her. "You knew about this?" Rebecca stepped into the garage. "Not about the letter, but the box, yes. Dad showed it to me about a year before he died. He made me promise not to tell you unless you came back. He was tracking me," James said, his voice rough. "All these years. He loved you," Rebecca said simply. "He never stopped loving you. He just didn't know how to say it." James gestured at the box, at the clippings, at the evidence of 20 years of secret devotion. "This isn't love. This is—" He stopped. What was it? Obsession? Penance? Or maybe just the only way a man like Robert Harrison knew how to express feelings he'd been taught to bury. "It's all he knew how to do," Rebecca said, as if reading his mind. She sat down on an overturned crate, leaving space between them. "You think you're the only one who's been carrying guilt, James? I watched both of you suffer for 20 years. I was the one who gave Mom your address. I was the one who told Dad about your projects, about Daniel, about everything. I was the bridge you both needed, but neither of you could cross." "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked. "Why didn't you tell me he cared? Would you have believed me?" Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. "You needed him to be the villain. It was the only way you could justify staying away. If I'd told you he was in pain, if I'd told you he asked about you constantly, if I'd told you he kept every article and every photo, what would you have done? Come back? Or just felt guilty and stayed away anyway?" James didn't have an answer. She was probably right. He'd built such a solid wall around his anger, such a fortress of justified resentment, that any crack in it would have felt like a betrayal of the boy he'd been. The 17-year-old who'd walked out with a duffel bag and a broken heart needed his father to stay frozen in time as the villain. Anything else would have made James's choices more complicated, more questionable, more human. Rebecca stood up and moved to the workbench. She picked up the letter, scanned it quickly, then set it back down. "He wrote that 3 days before he died. I was there when he did it. He could barely hold the pen. Mom wanted him to rest, but he insisted. Said he had one more thing to do before he ran out of time. He came to Chicago, James said. Did you know that, 20 years ago, the day after I left, he sat outside my apartment for 6 hours? Rebecca nodded slowly. I found out later. Mum knew. She was furious with him for not going to your door, but you know, Dad. She stopped. You knew, Dad. Once he made a decision, even a stupid decision, he'd die before he'd admit it was wrong. James let out a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. And then he literally did. Die before admitting it was wrong. He's admitting it now, Rebecca said, gesturing at the letter. 20 years too late. But he's admitting it. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the golden hour was fading into dusk. Soon it would be dark, and James would have to decide what to do with all these revelations. You couldn't just absorb information like this and go on with your life unchanged. It required something. Action, response, some kind of reckoning. There's more, Rebecca said quietly. Something I need to tell you. Something Dad made me promise I wouldn't tell you until after he was gone. James looked at her. What else could there possibly be? Rebecca took a breath. The day of Dad's funeral, when you stood at the back of the church and didn't come forward to see the casket. Do you remember what happened right before the service started? James thought back. The funeral was a blur. Too many people offering condolences he didn't feel entitled to. Too much gospel music. Too much talk about Robert Harrison being in a better place. He remembered standing at the back, arms crossed, refusing to play the part of the grieving son. And then, the organist played something, James said slowly, before the service started. It wasn't a hymn. It was something else. Something that felt out of place. Rebecca nodded. It was a song called Father and Son, by Cat Stevens. Dad requested it, made the organist learn it specifically for the funeral. He left instructions that it should be played before the service started, and that the organist should play it twice if you were there. James felt like he'd been hit in the chest. Father and Son. He knew that song. Had played it on guitar 100 times as a teenager. It was about a father and son who couldn't understand each other, couldn't bridge the gap between them, both convinced they were right. The father singing, "Take your time, think a lot, think of everything you've got." The son singing, "How can I try to explain? When I do, he turns away again." Two people talking past each other, both full of love and both completely unable to communicate it. He knew I'd recognize it, James said. He hoped you would, Rebecca corrected. He hoped it would be a message you could hear when you couldn't hear anything else. James stood up and walked to the garage door. The neighborhood was settling into evening routines, lights coming on in windows, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of a television through an open door. Normal life, the kind of life that seemed impossible when you were standing in your dead father's garage, learning that everything you thought you knew was a carefully constructed fiction. "There's something else in the letter," James said. "Something about a woman. Sarah Mitchell." Rebecca's face changed. "He told you about that? So it's true." "It was never physical," Rebecca said quickly. "Mom knew. He told her eventually. They worked through it. But yes, it happened. He was struggling that summer and he made some bad choices. Did Mom forgive him?" "Yes," Rebecca said. "It took time, but yes. They were married for 40 years, James. 40 years. People have ups and downs, moments of weakness. What matters is whether they choose to stay and do the work." She paused. "Dad stayed. He did the work. Whatever else you think about him, he didn't give up on his marriage. But he gave up on me," James wanted to say. Except that wasn't true either, was it? The box of photographs proved that. The newspaper clippings. The letter. Robert Harrison had never given up on his son. He'd just given up on the idea that he knew how to reach him. James picked up the photograph of his father watching him through the window. He studied it more closely now. The angle suggested it had been taken by someone standing nearby. His mother, probably, which meant she knew. She knew Robert watched James play guitar. She knew about the longing on his face, and she'd captured it on film, maybe hoping that someday James would see it and understand what he couldn't see in the moment. "I need to ask you something," James said. "And I need you to be honest." "Okay. The night I left, the things Dad said, did he ever say he regretted them?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Then, every single day, he'd be in the middle of dinner or watching TV or working in this garage, and he'd just stop and say, "I should have stopped him, I should have run after him." Mum would remind him that you were an adult making your own choices, and he'd say, "He was 17. 17 isn't an adult. He was my child, and I let him go. James felt tears on his face again. He didn't bother wiping them away. Why couldn't he just call? Why couldn't he write? Why did it have to be so hard? Because he was ashamed, Rebecca said. Because he'd preached about forgiveness and redemption for 30 years and couldn't figure out how to apply it to his own life. Because he kept waiting for the right moment, the right words, and the right moment never came. James looked at the letter again, at the shaking handwriting, at the words his father had finally found when death made waiting impossible. He ran out of time. We all run out of time eventually, Rebecca said. The question is what we do with the time we have. They stood there in the gathering darkness, brother and sister, both carrying their own versions of grief and regret and love. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. There's one more thing. In Dad's bedroom, in the drawer of his nightstand, there's a small envelope with your name on it. It's not a letter, it's something else, something he wanted you to have. Mum gave it to me after the funeral, said to give it to you if you ever came back. James felt his heart racing. What is it? I don't know. It's sealed, but you should go get it. You should read the rest of what Dad wanted to say before... She stopped. Before what? Rebecca looked at him directly. Before you decide whether you're going to keep running, or whether you're going to finally stop and deal with this. All of it. Not just Dad's death, but your own life. Daniel, your marriage. The way you keep everyone at arm's length because you're terrified of turning into Dad. James wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. He'd spent 25 years defining himself in opposition to Robert Harrison. I'll never be rigid like him. I'll never choose pride over relationship. I'll never make my child feel unworthy. But in running from his father's mistakes, he'd made his own. Different mistakes with the same result. A son who felt unseen, a father who didn't know how to close the distance. I'll go get it, James said. The envelope. Rebecca nodded and started to leave, then turned back. James, one more thing. Tomorrow is Sunday. Dad's church still has a service. I know you haven't been back there since the funeral, but maybe you should go. Maybe you should see the people who knew him, who loved him, who might help you understand the parts of him you never got to see. James didn't respond. He watched his sister walk back to her car, watched her taillights disappear down the street, and then he was alone in the garage with his father's ghosts and his own ghosts, and the weight of all the things that had been left unsaid for too long. James walked back into his mother's house. His house now, technically, though it would never feel like his. The air inside smelled like the potpourri his mother had loved, like old furniture and memories. He climbed the stairs to his parents' bedroom, a room he hadn't entered since he was a child. It felt like a violation somehow, stepping into this space where his parents had slept and fought and made up and grown old together. The nightstand drawer opened smoothly. Inside was a Bible, a pair of reading glasses, and a small cream-colored envelope identical to the one that had contained the letter. James's hands were steadier now. He'd been through so many revelations in the past few hours that he felt almost numb to surprise. Almost. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single item, his father's signet ring, the one with the cross and the letter H intertwined, the one Robert Harrison had been buried wearing, or so James had believed. Attached to the ring with a small piece of thread was a note in his mother's handwriting. James, your father changed his mind at the last minute. Said you should have this. Said you earned it. Said maybe you could pass it to Daniel someday, break the pattern he and his father couldn't break. All my love, Mom. James slipped the ring onto his finger. It was too large for most of his fingers, but fit perfectly on his right thumb. The weight of it felt significant, like a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. He thought about his grandfather, Thomas Harrison, the coal miner who beat his son for dreaming of seminary. He thought about his father, Robert, who'd escaped the mines but couldn't escape the patterns of silence and shame. He thought about himself, 42 years old, and still running from the same demons. And he thought about Daniel, 15 years old, passionate about music, desperate to be seen, standing at the same crossroads James had stood at, the same crossroads every Harrison man seemed destined to reach. But maybe it didn't have to end the same way. Maybe James could be the one to finally break the pattern. He pulled out his phone and texted Rebecca, I'll be at church tomorrow. Send. Then he texted Daniel, I'm coming home Monday. Can we talk? Really talk. Not me lecturing, just us talking. I want to hear about the band. I want to hear about everything. Send. The responses came quickly. Rebecca, "I'll save you a seat." Daniel: "Okay, yeah, that would be good." James sat on his parents' bed with his father's ring on his thumb and the letter in his pocket, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not forgiveness exactly. That would take time, might take years, might never come completely, but something softer than the anger he'd carried for 2 decades, something like understanding. His father had been broken. His grandfather had been broken. James was broken too. They'd all done the best they could with the tools they'd been given, and sometimes the best wasn't enough, but it was something. He thought about the box of photographs in the garage, the newspaper clippings, the evidence of 20 years of secret love. Maybe that was Robert Harrison's language. Documentation, preservation, keeping watch from a distance because he didn't know how to keep watch up close. It wasn't the love language James had needed, but it was love, nonetheless. Imperfect, cowardly, silent love that was better than no love at all. James stood up and walked to the window. He could see Oak Hill Cemetery from here, its white stones glowing in the moonlight. His father's grave was there, in the Harrison family plot next to his grandparents. James hadn't visited it since the funeral, hadn't been able to. But looking at it now, knowing what he knew, carrying his father's ring and his father's letter, and his father's hope that patterns could be broken, maybe it was time. He went downstairs and got in his car. The drive to Oak Hill took 7 minutes. The cemetery gates were technically closed, but they were never locked. James parked and walked through the rows of stones, his phone flashlight guiding the way. He knew where the Harrison plot was. Had avoided it for 20 years, but still knew exactly where it was, the way you always know where the things you're running from are located. His father's stone was simple. Reverend Robert James Harrison, beloved husband, father, servant of God. The dates of his life. Nothing about who he'd really been. The complicated, struggling, loving, failing human beneath the title. James stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but not praying either, talking to his father the way he'd never been able to talk to him in life. "I read your letter," he said aloud. The cemetery was empty, the words disappearing into the darkness. "I found the box. I know about Chicago. I know about Sarah Mitchell. I know about the Saturday mornings I don't remember, and Dad," his voice broke, "Dad, I'm so angry at you, for waiting too long, for making it so hard, for dying before we could fix this, but I also understand. I'm doing the same thing with Daniel that you did with me, and I'm going to stop. I'm going to break this pattern if it kills me. For him, for you, for me." He knelt down and touched the stone. The marble was cool beneath his palm. "I forgive you," he whispered, "and I'm sorry too, for staying away, for being too stubborn to reach out, for thinking I was the only one hurting. We were both hurting. We were both too proud and too scared, but I'm done running now. I'm done pretending you didn't matter. You did matter, you do matter. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever carried regret or wished for one more conversation with someone you've lost, please leave a like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments about your own journey with forgiveness. These stories connect us all." James stood up. He looked at the stone one more time, then walked back to his car. Tomorrow he'd go to First Baptist Church for the first time in 20 years. He'd sit in that sanctuary, where his father had preached for 3 decades. He'd let people tell him stories about Robert Harrison that might help him see the man beyond the father. And then he'd drive back to Chicago and have that conversation with Daniel. He'd tell him about his grandfather and his great-grandfather, and the pattern of silence that had poisoned 3 generations. And he'd ask Daniel to help him break it. The drive back to his mother's house took 7 minutes. James parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, looking at the garage where this had all started. The door was still open, light spilling out into the night. He got out of the car and walked inside one more time. The box of photographs sat on the workbench where he'd left it. James picked up the photo of himself at 17, guitar in his lap, his father watching through the window. He folded it carefully and put it in his wallet next to a photo of Daniel. Past and present, father and son, the same story told in different decades. Then he picked up the unfinished birdhouse, his father's last project. James examined it carefully, studying the pencil marks that showed where the roof should go. He could finish it. He had the skills. His father had taught him basic carpentry during those Saturday mornings he barely remembered. He could finish what Robert Harrison had started, complete this small act of creation that death had interrupted. James found the pieces his father had cut for the roof, still stacked neatly beside the project. He found wood glue and small finishing nails, and there in his father's garage at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, with tears drying on his face and his father's ring on his thumb, James Harrison finished his father's birdhouse. It took an hour. The work was meditative, focusing. Each measurement, each cut, each carefully placed nail was a kind of prayer, a way of saying, I'm here, I showed up, I'm doing the work you couldn't finish. When it was done, James stepped back and looked at it. Simple, but solid. A small shelter for small creatures who needed protection from the world. Maybe that's all any father could offer. Imperfect shelter, the best they knew how to build with the tools they had. James carried the birdhouse outside and hung it on a post in the backyard. His mother had liked watching birds. His father had built her feeders and houses over the years, creating a small sanctuary where cardinals and blue jays and wrens felt safe enough to nest. This would be the last one. The last house Robert Harrison had designed, finished by the son who'd finally come home. James stood in the backyard under the stars and felt something like peace. Not happiness. It was too soon for happiness. Too much grief still to process. But peace. The peace of knowing the truth, even when the truth was complicated. The peace of understanding that love isn't always expressed in the ways we need it to be, but that doesn't make it less real. The peace of finally being ready to stop running and start healing. His phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Dad, I was thinking about what you said, about really talking. Could we maybe play music together sometime? You still have your guitar, right? James looked at the text for a long moment. Then he typed, Yeah, I still have it. Hasn't been played in 20 years, but I still have it. I'd love to play music with you. How about next weekend? Sounds good, came the reply. Then, Love you, Dad. James stared at those 3 words. When was the last time Daniel had said them? Months ago? A year? Time did that. It let the important things slip away while you were busy being angry or hurt or right, but it wasn't too late. It was never too late while you were still alive, still breathing, still capable of choosing connection over pride. Love you too, son, James typed back. More than you know. He put his phone away and looked at the birdhouse one more time. In the morning, he'd call the pastor at First Baptist and ask if they wanted it. He'd tell them it was Robert Harrison's final project, completed by his son. They could put it in the church garden where his father used to walk, where he'd spent so many hours in prayer and contemplation. It would be a small memorial, a tangible reminder that even unfinished things could be completed, even broken relationships could be honored, even the longest silences could end with words that mattered. James walked back through the garage one final time, turning off the light and pulling the door closed. The letter was still in his pocket, along with the photograph. He'd keep them, read them again when he needed to remember that his father had been human, that pain didn't mean absence of love, that silence wasn't the same as not caring. He'd show them to Daniel someday, when his son was old enough to understand the weight of generational patterns and the courage it takes to break them. As James drove away from his childhood home for what might be the last time, he realized he was crying again. But these tears felt different, cleaner somehow, like rain washing dust from windows, allowing light to finally get through. He'd spent 20 years avoiding his father's grave, 20 years running from the pain of their fractured relationship, but tonight he'd finally stopped running. Tonight he'd stood at that grave and said the words that needed to be said. And tomorrow he'd sit in that church and begin the work of reconciliation. Not with his father, who was beyond reach, but with his own heart. The road stretched out before him in the darkness, leading back to Chicago, back to Daniel, back to the life he'd built in the shadow of his father's failures. But maybe now he could build something new, something that honored the good parts of what Robert Harrison had tried to teach him, while releasing the bad parts that had poisoned 3 generations. Maybe he could be the father Daniel needed, by learning from the father James had needed but never quite had. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of us could do, take the broken pieces we inherit and try to make something whole for the ones who come after us. It wasn't much, but it was something, and after 20 years of nothing, something felt like grace.